Hello, it's Sebastian, and I'm back in another setting. Now I'm in Fukuoka, the town where I lived for 7 years of my life. So everything is feeling both fresh and nostalgic, and what better setting to have when talking about the best books of 2024. I think this is the very first time when I'm making a best of the year video that the list doesn't naturally just fall into 6 or 7 books. Usually it's absolutely no problem for me to find the best 6 or 7 books of a year, but this time it was totally different. First of all, let's do the honourable mentions for some fantastic books which didn't quite make the list. I'll read them out. Idle Burning by Rinusami, A Shining by John Fossa, The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, Outline by Rachel Cusk, The Age of Anxiety by W.H. Auden, and Alcestis. 2 versions, one by Ted Hughes and the original by Euripides. It feels kind of like almost painful for me to have Euripides in the honourable mentions rather than in the best of list, because I usually try to read one Euripides play a year, and usually that play is in the top 10, top 6, whatever. But this one, I don't know, it could be recency bias, but it didn't, because I read it at the very beginning of the year, but I felt it just didn't quite get into the top 10 bracket. I also want to give a shout out to Darkness Visible by Nicholas Tucker. It's a kind of guidebook for historic materials by Philip Pullman. This was the best book that I found while I was at my parents' place in London, because like when I was going through all these childhood books and stuff, this was a present that I'd gotten from my sister years and years ago, probably like around the time that I was reading historic materials. And since it's not really a biography, it's more sort of like a guidebook with little chapters about different aspects of Philip Pullman and how he wrote historic materials. I guess like I never properly read it cover to cover, I just dipped in and out of it. But when I opened it this time, I found something amazing. Basically, one of my favorite writers, Heinrich von Kleist, whose work I have a little bit of here, is difficult to find easily translated into English. Like you can find it, but it's often like quite expensive. But every time I see his name written down on a book cover, my heart always stops, because I'm like, maybe it'll have something, translated that I haven't read before. And one of his most famous non-fiction pieces, an essay called On the Marionette Theatre, apparently was a big inspiration on Philip Pullman when he was writing his dark materials. So it's mentioned, there's a little section on Heinrich von Kleist in Darkness Visible. And not only that, but there's an appendix at the end of the book which has the essay by Heinrich von Kleist translated into English. I was over the moon when I found this. All these years in my childhood bookshelves, I had one of the major works of one of my favorite writers, although not at the time I was a child, but one of my favorite writers' main works translated there into English. God, it was amazing. So I was really happy, and I read that like right before I left London, and it was great. The essay itself wasn't as phenomenal as the discovery of the essay in the Philip Pullman book from my childhood, if that makes sense. And then finally, this is quite a big preamble, but that's what I mean. There's been so many kind of good book experiences that I've had this year that I just can't cram them all into a list. But this one should be on the list, really. Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lenin. I started reading this in November while listening to it on the audiobook, and I want to talk about it so much, and I have so many thoughts, and it's still very fresh in my mind, but the loan period ran out, and I hadn't finished it. I'd gotten through most of it, but I hadn't finished it, and the loan period still hasn't renewed, so I haven't been able to get back to it, which is very frustrating because it feels like a big key reading experience of 2024, but it's also a kind of plotty book, and I feel the plot does matter, and I don't know where it's going to go, and I feel like where it goes will affect my enjoyment of it. Some books, even if I haven't read the last few chapters of them, I feel like I have a really strong idea of them, whereas this one, I don't know exactly. I can't say what I think about it until I've finished it and put a seal on it in my mind, I think. So it's going to be a 2025 book, I guess. And yeah, I expect it will be on the best books of 2025 list when I make that next year. Watch this space. So, the list. And these are going in ascending order from least best to best best. Number 10, I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. First off, like, you gotta give plaudits to the marketing team here. Like, that cover, the colors, the font, the title and the taboo, it's all comes together really well. And every time I saw this book cover, I wanted to just pick it up and find out what was going on. The title is also like, I don't know, there's so much to say about the title, right? Like it being a taboo. It felt wrong when I was typing into a Word document to make notes, even just to type out, I'm glad my mom died. Even saying it feels kind of wrong to me. That's how strong that image of motherhood and like the sort of the sacred image of the mother in Western culture is, I guess. Not just Western culture, but you know what I mean? mean? It's effective, at least it was for me. The title also does a lot of work in the actual text, not just as a sort of cover, but like in the book itself. It's divided into two sections, a before and an after. Before being before Jeanette McCurdy's mum's death, talks about her childhood and growing up, and it's a really, really kind of almost excruciating but fascinating relationship, which is made all the more interesting because of the title. Like, we know that the Jeanette McCurdy we're reading about at the start of the book adores her mother and has a really strong relationship with her mother, even as we read how the mother is pushing her to become an actor when she doesn't really want to become an actor, and she's kind of leading the daughter to lead the life that the mother would have wanted to lead, and all these kind of controlling and manipulative behaviors, which nonetheless stem from a place of kind of love and care, are really fascinating to read about. But they also give you a kind of narrative push when you know that we're going towards a Jeanette McCurdy who will eventually be glad that her mom died, or at least we presume so from the title, right? So that gives this kind of urgency and like page turneriness to the beginning. The thing that I think is most striking about this book, and like really like in the before section especially, is exemplified, is the way that it both details this intimate portrayal of childhood development and like how a child grows into a person, into an adult, while also feeling like a kind of societal portrayal of America, especially. Like, reading it, I feel like I'm reading about America just as much as I feel like I'm reading about a very specific child and a specific mother and their relationship with each other. So that just in itself is really impressive, I think. Jeanette McCurdy is also really good at honing in on the emotionally tangled and dense moments that exist in very mundane day-to-day life and capturing that in a short chapter. Each chapter feels like it's kind of short and it's written in very simple and easy to understand everyday language, but it also feels like it's a little bit self-contained and has its own little theme and adds another little building block into the personality. I guess it's a coming-of-age story as well as a memoir. But yeah, despite each short chapter having its own kind of self-contained themes, they do just fly by. It's immensely readable. And then in the after section, it's still very readable because a lot of surprising developments take place. The focus kind of shifts more onto the eating disorders that McCurdy has developed as a result, partially with her relationship with her mother. And the tone does become a lot darker, and the story more harrowing as her mental health worsens. At the same time, it does start to lose some of its complexity in the second part, I think, because it starts to feel more like the story of a celebrity overcoming an eating disorder, living with and overcoming, or trying to overcome an eating disorder. And like, I don't know, it's kind of what I would expect that story to sound like. But that does actually make a lot of sense because, like, you know, when people go through the healing process for these kinds of things, often it makes sense to take something emotionally dense and tangled and simplify it and categorize it. And she talks about how, you know, after going to the therapist, she was learning to categorize emotions and stuff into more like kind of manageable chunks, right? Like, but of course, if you kind of categorize and simplify things, then that does make a story less original and kind of fascinating, I suppose, to read. But that said, overall, it was still an absolutely amazing read and full of all these moments which feel very everyday but are also so haunting and kind of tragic. Like, there's this one scene where she, as a child, is invited to have a meal with the creator of the show on Nickelodeon that she's starring in. And when the meal is put in front of her, she starts trying to eat it in two different ways. She starts to eat it so that when the creator of the show looks at her, it looks like she's enjoying the meal and really grateful for the food that he's provided for her, because she knows that if she doesn't eat it at all, then he'll probably get angry and like, you know, why didn't you show appreciation for what I did for you? But at the same time, she wants her mother to get the opposite impression, that she's not eating very much because she's taking care of her figure, because she doesn't want to get loads of calories, which will make her body start to mature quicker and lose its kind of childlike frame. And this kind of like monstrous way of thinking. So just by having a meal put in front of her between these two controlling and easy to displease figures of authority, we see that she's got to try and keep this delicate emotional balance between them as she tries to eat, or at least she feels that that's the only way that she can eat that meal, which is, I don't know, like horrifying, but also like just fascinating in the way you see how adults' behavior, infuses just these very simple day-to-day activities like eating a meal with all these like kind of seeds of psychic damage which are gonna like kind of plague children as they develop and grow older. But yeah, great book. Number 9, Tale of a Castle Keep by Izumi Kyoka. It's been a good year for fantasy for me. This is the first fantasy on the list. This is a play about magical creatures living on the 5th floor of a castle keep in feudal Japan. And it centers around Princess Tomi, who is among these magical creatures. And she has invited another princess from a different tower to come and visit. So she's going to host her friend, basically. Conflict soon arises because of the humans, those pesky humans, and their warring ways. This is during the Warring States period in Japan. The humans are living down below in the kind of castle proper and going about doing their violent things, and their violence threatens to encroach on the magical upper levels of the castle keep. So you know the fantasy setup, right? Where you have a human who, like from our world, who stumbles into a magical world and meets all these strange creatures and then starts going on these little adventures. And we share in that human's reactions as they're introduced to whatever, dragons and princesses and so on, and like kind of the strangeness of that world. That human is kind of a guide for us, or almost a proxy for the reader to be introduced to a new magical landscape, right? That is kind of like a really staple fantasy trope. Well, this play is like an inversion of that, because we, the reader, start with the fantasy creatures in the fantasy world and have no idea what's going on. I didn't realize that Princess Tomi was a magical being until quite a way into it. So everything actually feels kind of surreal. And then the sort of human character only stumbles in like halfway through the play. And then after he stumbles in, then we can kind of understand the relationship between the magical world and the world of mere mortals. But like I said, halfway through the play, right? So by this point, we've already kind of gotten used to being in the magical world. The interesting thing is that when you rearrange the order like this, you know, when we, the reader, are not following a human guide into the world, when we're just stuck there and eventually the human comes to us, it actually felt more like surrealism than fantasy in lots of ways. Like at one point a present is offered, and this present turns out to be a human head, a decapitated head, right? But it's covered in blood. So an old woman is asked to clean it. So she extends her tongue and licks all the blood off of it. And she's like, wow, it's so good. And you're like, what's going on? But nobody bats an eyelid. And then she gives it back, and you're, what's happening? But it doesn't matter, right? Because we just roll with him, on to the next scene. So in some ways it does feel like surrealism rather than fantasy at the start. And that kind of mix of the surreal and the fantasy genre was something that I've never read before. So that was great. I read 3 very strange, kind of experimental, poetic plays this year: Age of Anxiety, Alcestis, and this one. And all of them could have been on this list, but I think some of the images and the kind of freshness and strangeness of this one just is going to stay with me forever. I feel like the world of this castle keep is somewhere that I could go to in my imagination, which is different for surrealism, right? Because surrealism, generally just anything can happen. But this actually did feel very much like a place and a fantasy world, which, yeah, I don't know, it's going to stay with me. Number 8, The Exploits of Moominpappa. And if my annual Euripides didn't make it onto this list, then at least my annual Tove Jansson book did. So yeah, Moomins, just always great. But the thing that's really different about this one is that it's the memoirs recounting Moominpappa's youth. So it's in first person, which is very strange and wonderful. And kind of brave, I think, of Tove Jansson in a way, because up to this point in her writing about the Moomins, there's always a bit of a distance between the narrative voice and the characters' voices. We feel very much like we're just there listening to their dialogue and enjoying their company. In this one, yeah, the first person kind of, in a way, limits what we can see, because everything has to be just one of these simple characters' viewpoints. And Moominpappa, as well, is great in his own way, but also he has to carry the whole book by himself, so it's quite impressive. She does kind of get away from this by having some scenes where he stops writing the memoirs and we see him and he's reading them to the kind of the kids, the, you know, Moomin Troll and Snufkin and the main characters usually in the Moomin series, and we get kind of reactions between them as an audience and him as the narrator, right? So I guess the image that she's going for is that we are like with the children, like listening to a storyteller recounting his tales, which in one way I didn't like because I love Moominpappa so much, and it's done so well. I just want his voice. I want his memoir, pure and simple. I don't want to be distanced from it in any way at all. But on the other hand, it is nice because there's certain things in his story which sometimes, if you think about them, don't make so much sense. And if you think that he's writing it for this particular audience, then it all makes more sense. Like maybe he's colored the past a bit because of who he's reading his memoirs to as he's writing them. But yeah, Moominpappa, it seems, even from his birth, has been full of infectious enthusiasm and affable egocentrism. And he's just ready to go on adventures. And meet new people and sail the seas. At the same time, not go too far, because all the Moomins are pretty conservative characters, and at the end of the day they want to have like a nice fire and the comforts of home and jam and stuff like this. Let me read you the first sentence from the preface. I, Moominpappa, am sitting tonight by my window, gazing into my garden, where the fireflies embroider their mysterious signs on the velvet dark. Perishable flourishes of a short but happy life. Like... that just sets you up for what's going to happen here, because it's flowery, it's ornate, it's ridiculous, but it's also kind of beautiful, and it's pompous, but it's also kind of beautiful, right? And I don't know, the descriptions of nature and everything like that reflect always his kind of inflated sense of his self, which is adorable. He's just adorable. From that same preface we have, I believe many of my readers will thoughtfully lift their snout from the pages of this book every once in a while to exclaim, "What a Moomin!" or "This indeed is life." It's so funny. Tove Jansson is a master of humor, I think, and characterization, and making characters which you can laugh at and love at the same time. I think sometimes, taken out of context, the Moomins seem a little bit too corny and simple, and just kind of feel good. Like there's this one part where Moominpappa writes a note because he runs away from his orphanage, and in his sort of like running away note, his farewell note, I suppose, he puts "Life is short and the world is enormous" as his reason for leaving, right? And I've seen that quote being put places like kind of like, wow, we need to go and have adventures, and it's true. But also the fact that he's running away and he kind of wants to leave a note that will make people feel bad, for not treating him better than they did, and for not appreciating his presence. So this "life is short and the world is enormous" is good because it's petty and it's vindictive and it's self-aggrandizing, and he's sort of like, casting himself as going off on these wonderful adventures because he wants people to think of himself in a certain way, right? But at the same time, it's genuine and it's full of this urgency and this desire to live life to the fullest. So the fact that she gets all these different elements into these short little phrases is one of the things that makes Tove Jansson an absolute genius, in my opinion. This book would probably be higher on the list if it weren't for the fact that it kind of runs out of steam a little bit towards the end, and introduces some really dark elements like colonialism. He becomes a colonist for a king, and there's a kind of satire going on there, but I don't think she quite pulls it off, or like, I don't know if she can pull it off in the context of what the Moomins are, and like kind of the fact that this is a kid's fantasy novel. And then there's another thing where a monster actually gets killed, which is very un-Ghibli-like, right? Like an evil monster, not rather than turn out to just be like kind of friendly, or be looking for its handbag, actually gets killed, and everybody celebrates the fact that it gets killed. So that felt a little bit, I don't know, it's dark, but do we need to go there? Like, I think I would probably leave that part out if I was reading it to a very young child. Number 7, Trouble with Lichen by John Wyndham. John Wyndham writes about civilizational change, usually because of some sort of sci-fi apocalypse. There is an alien under the sea, or a plant that can move, or psychic children, which were aliens. Usually it's aliens. But yeah, something happens which means that human society is going, not society, civilization will change slowly and gradually because of some monumental event. And this event is so monumental, it's going to take, generations for its effects to be fully felt, right? In the meantime, we have ordinary characters from his time period, the 1950s, just trying to live their everyday lives and get on with things, while this kind of world-altering, usually sinister alien threat is going on in the background, right? He always places this kind of threat and change and like kind of powerful force for civilizational change in the background, while our main characters talk to each other about that thing over there, and say like kind of, wonder what's going to happen, and they're drinking cups of tea, and occasionally they will have like run-ins with the thing itself, but basically his books are built around this kind of dynamic, just ordinary people having cozy chats. Trouble with Lichen is one of his later books, and he develops that kind of formula in a really interesting way. At the beginning part of the book, the kind of the thing that's going to bring civilizational change is an ordinary young woman called Diana. From the prologue, we know that she is going to be world-altering in a way that I didn't really like, but I guess it sets up the kind of feeling she is an important person. It starts with her funeral, by the way, and like everybody at her funeral and all the newspapers and blah, blah, blah. So we knew that she was a big deal, not just like a celebrity, but like kind of an important person for the human species, whatever that means. We don't know at the beginning. But then we flash back and she becomes the thing in the background that everyone is talking about all the time. And the thing about her, which is so socially disruptive, is the fact that she is very attractive, interested in looking good, like fashion and so on, and she's incredibly intelligent and wants to become a biologist. So the combination of these things in the 1950s setting is enough to make her kind of a societal threat. Everybody is wondering which way she will go. Will she embrace the side of her which likes nice clothes and go and find a good husband and make her way into society that way as a housewife? Or will she cast aside that, sort of feminine side of herself, devote herself to matters of the mind and science and become a scientist and, enter society through that door, right? What's clear to everyone is that there are only those two doors available for a woman, or at least a certain number of types, as one character says. She's very odd, but eventually she's going to settle down into one of 4 or 5 types. Everyone's got a preset idea of what a woman can be, and everyone is a little bit disturbed by Diana because she hasn't yet, embodied one clear path. Just the fact that Wyndham decided, instead of having an alien come to Earth, just to pick an ordinary woman as the disruptor, which is going to change everything, is amazing, I think. Of course it means that this wouldn't be a science fiction if that was all that happened, but it does become a science fiction because she makes a scientific discovery which is in fact going to change the world, and then that becomes a sort of the background menace to societal norms. We even get this nice little exchange towards the end of the book, just to give you some flavor. It's between a politician and his aide when the discovery is starting to come out into the world, and the politician says, "I don't like it, my boy, don't like it at all. If the claims are true, or only half true, the effects are going to be apocalyptic, sir. Thank you, Henry. Le mot juste, I fear." So this is exactly what the whole thing is like all the way through, which is, also really fun to read. Also, I think that might be the only time John Wyndham uses the word apocalyptic in his corpus, at least that I can recall at the moment. And it's kind of ironic because he writes about, aliens destroying the world often. So the fact that it's in this book, which is so much just about feminism and about gender roles, and also about aging and youth, and what that means for the genders as well, in the context of the 1950s or 1960s, is just really fascinating. That's the thing. I love this book so much, and I want to buy it and own it and give it to people to read. But at the same time, I think it really works based on its context. It's written before the second wave of feminism, but after the first wave. So Wyndham is trying to imagine, based on the frustrations of, I think, women and men, but especially women of his time, he's trying to imagine another kind of feminism. And ironically, this thing did actually happen, but not in the way that he imagines, or in a non-sci-fi context. There was a second wave of feminism. That kind of alternative history thing is also just really fascinating. Now, I mentioned him at the start of the video, and he's coming back now. It's Heinrich von Kleist at number 6 with The Broken Pitcher. This is another play. It's a comedy. It's apparently very famous in Germany. It's about a judge in a little town. An inspector is coming because apparently a lot of these provincial judges haven't been dishing out justice in the way that they should be according to the capital. This is in the Netherlands, by the way. He always writes historical fiction. Everything that he's ever written, I think, is in some way historical fiction. But he always picks a certain place in the world and a certain time, and then infuses it with his weirdness. But yeah, I should tell you the plot. This judge is being judged by another judge who comes from the capital to make sure that he's not corrupt and doing things correctly. Of course, he is corrupt. He's terribly corrupt. But the whole drama lies in the trial that he's overseeing. So basically, the defendant is claiming that her jug was broken when a man broke into her house and knocked it over. However, the subtext is that the man was going into her daughter's room. So we quickly get the sense that the real reason this trial is being held is because the mother is trying to defend her daughter's honor. Because obviously, if some strange man is coming into her room at night, it's going to look very bad in this small village. So the broken jug is sort of like a pretense for the daughter's chastity, right? The thing is that the person who was breaking into the daughter's room, we find out very, very quickly, if you're paying attention anyways, is the judge himself. So what we have is a judge who is also being judged, overseeing a trial where he himself is the culprit. And so how he manages this situation and all the different characters involved in the scene is very, very, very funny. I read half of this in Vancouver where I laughed very much, and I read the other half in the British Library where I had to hold all my laughs in because it was a very, very, very quiet room, and I would have disturbed everyone who's doing all the research and stuff. But it was still just a hilarious play and really fun and witty and also like kind of crazy. The hard thing about this was I found in Vancouver all these different translations, but I couldn't read a lot of them because they were just, I thought I couldn't tell if they were so bad or if the language was just so complex. And I think it was kind of a mix of both. I think it's just incredibly difficult to translate Kleist's plays, apparently, especially this one, because of the way that he writes using idioms and kind of like German language specific kind of puns, and also like in a really fragmented way, like breaking up sentences into just like stops and starts, like little words that go back and forth between characters. So one character will be saying one thing broken up and another character will be trying to say something else broken up. So it'll be two like different lines of thought and it's all fragmented. So yeah, an interesting thing was in the copy that I did read, the translation was by John Swan. That was the best one that I could find. But he had like a kind of appendix of which at the end, which included some like early versions that Kleist did. And I read one of the early versions of a scene and it was so much clearer to understand what was actually happening in the scene. So obviously Kleist deliberately muddied the waters. He deliberately wanted things to sound broken, disjointed, fragmented, chaotic, and he would write things and then rewrite them to be more crazy. The main reason I like this play so much is because I really wondered if this writer, who I love so much, would be able to write a comedy, or rather, like, would I like his comedies? You know what I mean? Because the short stories are all I'd read by him up to that point. And I love his stories, but they're often really tragic and sometimes kind of hellish. And so, like, and I don't know, I'm kind of particular when it comes to comedy. I usually don't laugh that much when I'm reading. And also, this is one of his early works, so I thought, like, I don't know if I like it or not. But yeah, I'm so kind of pleased to have that affirmation that he was on it from the start, was Kleist. And some parts of it, especially at the beginning, reminded me of Gogol in the sort of the absurd way that the countryside is having to deal with the city officials. And then other parts of it reminded me of Euripides towards the end with there's a sort of Deus Ex Machina, but it's not exactly a Deus Ex Machina. It kind of fell down a little bit in the end, also because there's some ableism, which is unfortunate. Kleist is usually really on the ball with these kind of things, but yeah, that didn't age so well. But anyway, overall, I really recommend this play if you can get your hands on it, especially the translation by John Swan. Number 5 is another classic, another work in translation, and another one of my all-time favorite writers. It's The Lover's Handbook by Ovid, translated by F.A. Wright. This was another one where I struggled finding a good translation. And I'm still not sure if this is the best translation or not. It was just the one that really spoke to me. This is basically a kind of satire of didactic poetry, which is a genre that the Romans would use to teach people their morals, and they would write it in a certain meter, and he wrote in that meter. And that's why I like the translation of the title, which is the Lover's Handbook. You know, it's like, this is, you know, a guide, please use this, you know, and it's really instructions. But the reason why it's a satire is because it's like telling people to be adulterous and to, you know, like be debauched and to, you know, be decadent and kind of all the kind of things that the Roman Emperor Augustus was advocating against. He was trying to create this sort of more patriarchal, honor-based society where, you know, like kind of marriage was sacred and ideals are noble and so on. And then Ovid writes something in the style of, you know, like a kind of propagandistic, let's all behave in this appropriate way, and he writes it about sex. It's really like just about sex at the end of the day. It's charming, it's witty, it's a little horny in places, and actually for me one of the most interesting things was seeing how it's a in-between stage in Ovid's career. He begins with like love poetry and like kind of witty lyrical love poetry, and then he writes this big epic the Metamorphoses about Greek mythology, and starts writing about mythology in a really serious way. And in this one, he sometimes, rarely, but sometimes when he's making a mythic comparison, when he's giving his love advice, he just goes off on one. He goes off on this massive tangent to tell a Greek myth instead. And that was great. I love it when people go on great tangents, you know, like tangents done well is one of my favorite things in writing. I've said it before, I'm sure I'll say it again, but this book had some great tangents in it. It's fascinating seeing the ways that, you know, the kind of advice for lovers that you see in magazines today is the same as what he's writing here, although he's writing it in a kind of more fun and less sincere way, I think. We get stuff like, of course, if you're a millionaire, I shall not trouble to advise you. You need not wit. Your lady fair will never for lack of that despise you. Far stronger than a poet's verse is, I will pay, and here's my purse. And here's one of the examples from myth, which I really like, where there's a myth where Heracles, after he did a lot of his labors, was forced to become a slave to the queen Omphale, and she used to dress him up, or command him to dress up in women's clothing and dance with all her women, while she would take his club and his lion skin and like kind of be all macho, and he would have to perform femininity for her. When he had slain the monster brood and wearied out fierce Hera's spite, before he in high heaven stood, the heaven won by virtue's right, the prince of Tyrants bent his knee and deigned a woman's toy to be. They say that he among the girls would take the wool and weave and spin in maiden smock with hanging curls and sit in the harem within. He was a slave, nor thought it shame. So why should you not do the same? So, like, this is advice to a man, obviously, to become a slave to a woman, and saying, like, there's absolutely nothing unmanly about, you know, getting yourself up in drag and being a slave to a woman, because even Heracles, who is the pinnacle of masculinity, did it, right? So by today's standards, I feel like that's pretty progressive, but there's also stuff which isn't, and that might also have to do with the translation. This translation is also from the 1920s, right? So I can't help feeling that some of the gender stuff in the language just comes from the time period in which it was being written. Gotta learn Latin, I guess, just gotta learn Latin. There's also an interesting thing is that the first part is written for men. It's a handbook for men on how to get female lovers, and then the second part, or the third part, I think, is for women on how to get men. So it's also fun to kind of compare and contrast the different advice that he gives to the different genders. It's for the most part all very superficial stuff, but like Oscar Wilde, for example, Ovid just loves reveling in the superficial, and it's really fun to be there and revel with him. Number 4 is another work which seems very superficial on the surface. But is that all there is to it? It's The Curious Sofa, a pornographic work by Ogdred Weary. This was written by Edward Gorey, actually. He wrote under lots of pseudonyms, which were usually anagrams of his name, Edward Gorey, and Ogdred Weary, I think, was one of the main pseudonyms that he used. This is a book that is actually a reread for me. 2 rereads are on this list, this one and another one. This, I normally don't put rereads on like best of the year lists, but in this case, I think in both cases, it's warranted because the work is such a revelation that it feels like it's something I hadn't encountered before, and I noticed stuff that I just didn't realize, and it's now, you know, like kind of in my top tiers, whereas I totally forgot it existed. I actually found it, thought it was perfect, gave it to a friend immediately thinking it was the perfect gift for that friend. I still do, and then forgot that it existed. So I read it and gave it away, and that was it. And I was in London this time, and said friend reminded me about the book, and I didn't remember it at all until I had it in my hand and was reading it, and then I read the whole thing because it's very, very short. It's written in this faux Victorian style, which is very entertaining, where Edward Gorey chronicles the adventures of a young woman named Alice and her acquaintances, and basically describes something in an incredibly indirect way, which we can presume, given the marriage of the text and the picture, to be a sexual act. However, we never actually read any sexual act or see any sexual act. It's always implied. So for example, we'll have like one page will have a big picture in a square, and then underneath we'll have text, and the text will say something like, in the back of the carriage on the way to the station, Lord Arthur showed Alice something she had never seen before. And then in the picture we just see like a dark carriage and a white hand extending like kind of from the floor, right? So something's obviously going on on the bottom of the carriage, right? Now I read a review somewhere, I think, although I can't find it again, so maybe I made it up in my head, I don't know. But I read somewhere, I think, that there's two ways to read this book. One is that it's a kind of fun, like nudge kind of sniggery kind of sex joke book. The second way to read it is with the sense of something a little bit more uneasy going on, and a little bit more maybe philosophical in a way. And as you can imagine, like that's the reason that this book is so high in this list, is because I'm more towards the second way of reading it. It is really fun, it is really silly, it is really sexy, but also there's something about it's saying something about the obscene, right? The fact that we never see the act that's going on, and we kind of presume it to be sexual, starts to change as it goes on. Like it gets more and more surreal. I'll put a picture over here, like one picture that I quite like, where you've got everybody's in the trees and somebody's head is coming up from the bottom corner and somebody's foot is coming down from the top corner, the opposite top corner, and it creates this nice symmetry. And also it just doesn't make much sense because like the branches are so thin at the top. Like what would somebody be doing clinging to those really thin branches? Also it's got that titillation thing going on of the tree branches covering up certain parts of the body, but it's also just like strange. There's the grapes being passed up through the branches as well. It's quite artistic, I think. And as it gets towards the ending, there's reason to think that maybe it's not just sex, like the taboo, the thing that we can't talk about, that we can only kind of make jokes about and circle around and kind of point at and snigger and kind of be drawn to, that it maybe it's not just sex, maybe there's something actually horrible going on there as well, is kind of implied towards the end. And then it just ends. You know, there's no answers, there's no resolution. It's more like a book of vibes. That's the thing, yeah, with this book, you read it for the sexy jokes or you read it for the dark vibes, or you kind of have a mix of the two is probably the best way to approach it. In any case, it's one of my favorite books of the year. I think it's unrecognized as like one of Edward Gorey's masterpieces, but it probably should be. Next up, not a book but a short story, although kind of a book, because I only read the first short story, the first chapter of Bakakai by Witold Gombrowicz, but the book itself also left a big impression on me. I found it haphazardly in the library, in my local library in London. It was very striking on the shelf, looked very new, looked very yellow. It's by a writer who I've been really meaning to read more of. And it was a collection of short stories. I usually quite like short stories, so and I hadn't read any in ages. So I just took it out of the library. I saw an interesting sticker on the inside of the book which said that it is a gift from the Polish embassy, and presumably to various libraries in the UK. Which is just a cool kind of gift to give, I guess. And I saw also I was the first stamp in the book, so I don't know if the gift came recently or if just it's not a very popular gift, but it looks quite new. So in any case, I was very honored to be the first stamp in that book. As I said, I only read the first short story before I had to return the book, but based on that story, and also based on, I don't know, the cover of the book, the color of the book, the feeling I get when I hold the book in my hands, I really want to own this book. It's rare that I have this feeling that like I just want to own a book without having read all of it. But I actually want to own this and put it in a sort of special place because I'm sure it's going to be a favorite. Even if just for the first story, lawyer Kraykowski's Dancer, which I will read you the beginning of now. I was on my way to see the operetta The Gypsy Princess for the 34th time, and, since it was late, I bypassed the line and went straight to the lady at the ticket window. My dear madam, please just quickly give me my usual, in the balcony. When, suddenly, someone took hold of me from behind and coldly, yes, coldly, dragged me away from the window and pushed me back to my proper place, i.e. the end of the line. My heart began pounding. I was short of breath. Is it not a murderous thing when a person is suddenly taken by the collar in a public spot? But I looked around. He was a tall, vigorous, fragrant individual with a short, trimmed moustache. He was conversing with two fashionably dressed ladies and one gentleman and checking the tickets he had just bought. They all looked at me. And I had to say something. one of my favorite openings ever to a short story. I've got so much that I love in that. The first sentence is the first half of that paragraph. It ends with him being dragged away, right? The sentence begins with him rushing that he doesn't miss the play and ends with him being dragged away by the collar in public. Oh, I love it so much. This is probably my favorite type of narrator, this kind of loser. You'll find him in Gogol, you'll find him in Dostoevsky, and I'm so happy that I found another writer's version of him. This guy who is uptight, obsessive, neurotic. He's just such a weirdo. He's very full of himself while at the same time being convinced of his low standing in society. He's tormented but full of a joy for life. He's petty. He's a bit like Moominpappa if Moominpappa was like really poor and twisted, you know what I mean? Like, and quite misogynist. That's the thing that is interesting. This writer, Gombrowicz, always has, I say always, I've only read one novel by him, but his main characters has been like quite misogynistic in that one and in this one. But in this one, the misogyny is more interesting. There's a sort of queer logic at the heart of it. Like the reason the main character starts instructing a woman to behave a certain way is because she doesn't know the best way to behave as a woman. But he, as a man, in fact, does know the best way that a woman should behave, because these roles for women were made for the benefit of men. So in fact, by that logic, he as a man would be a better woman than this woman. And so he ends up kind of confusing his own gender role in the logic for why this woman is not performing hers correctly. And there is a very interesting queer, homoromantic, homosexual thread going through this story as well. Just this sense of life trying to burst through the page through this guy's unhealthy madness is really fun to read. There's one bit where he's just been humiliated again in public in a really degrading way, and his response is, he says in a sort of like masochistic way, I guess, is too little of everything, more, ever more. You get the sense that even as he's suffering, he's just having the best time, or that he's so far gone into whatever weird logic world that he's been twisted into by society or whatever, that this is how he finds his purest happiness. I guess in a way it's kind of dark, but more than that, I found it very, very funny and fun and well written. Just Gombrowicz is an incredible writer. Number 2 on the list. I'm already in the sort of like new favorites now. I think like these top 3 are definitely like kind of all-time new favorites. And number 2 is actually interesting as a new favorite because it's also a reread, like I mentioned before. It's the other reread on this list. It's Truckers by Terry Pratchett. Weirdly enough, I just finished the second book in this series, Diggers, which I have here. And so this is the one that's really fresh in my mind, rather than the first one, which I read at the very beginning of the year, so a whole year ago now. But handily, this has a synopsis of the first book at the beginning. So I'll just read the beginning of that as a way in. In the beginning, Arnold Bross, Est 1905, created the store. At least that was the belief of thousands of gnomes who for many generations had lived under the floorboards of Arnold Bross, Est 1905, an old and respected department store. The store had become their world, a world with a roof and walls. Wind and rain were ancient legends, so were day and night. Now there were sprinkler systems and air conditioners, and their small, crowded lives ticked to the clock of opening time and closing time. The seasons of their year were January sales, spring into spring fashions, summer bargains, and Christmas fair. Led by the abbot and priesthood of the stationery, they worshipped, in a polite, easygoing sort of way, so as not to upset him, Arnold Bross, S. 1905, who they believed had created everything, i.e. the store and all the contents therein. And into the store, on the back of a lorry, came the last gnomes to live outside. They knew what wind and rain were all right. That's why they tried to leave them behind. So yeah, gnomes, love them. Because the story continues into this one, it's really hard for me to separate these two in my mind at the moment, because this is so fresh. So, and I made a whole video on my experience of reading the first book, so maybe I'll just link there. What I will say though, because I was talking about the movements earlier, is that Terry Pratchett, this is a children's book, right? I guess a middle grade book, and Terry Pratchett kind of has in common with Tove Jansson an ability to write in simple language which children will understand about like kind of really resonant philosophical themes which are quite abstract, and then break them down in a way which seem like kind of fun and fantasy, but for adults I guess are like pretty deep and about life and so on. And they're also like really lighthearted, right? But where they differ in a big way is that when Tove Jansson originally published The Moomins as a comic strip, I think it was in a socialist magazine in Finland, right? Yeah, and eventually they got pulled because a lot of the readers complained that the Moomins were too middle class, which is true. They're supposed to be kind of like wild creatures, right? But they just instinctively have all these bourgeoisie needs and attitudes. So their middle class-ish nature is something that's just naturally there in the world, that there's different levels of creatures, is something that I imagine would really annoy a lot of socialists. It doesn't really annoy me so much because it's kind of mocking middle class attitudes, I think, in a way. There's a satirical element of the movements all the way through, but also I see the problematic side of it. However, in Truckers, that problem doesn't exist. As you might have gleaned from the sort of satirism of consumer culture and religion going on in that synopsis, it's quite Marxist friendly. It's got like ways of reading it which show how social groups are formed, how social groups change, how those social groups need to work together to create new kind of group identities, how we can actually make progressive change. Like logistically speaking, when people usually don't want to change that much, they just want to get on with their lives and stuff. That is like the central theme really of Truckers, and it gets developed even more in Diggers, which is also great. So already I have another book ready for my best of 2025. That's two books already, and we haven't even really gotten going with the year yet. So like it's looking good, folks. And now the top spot, something else I've also talked about a lot, so some people will already be able to guess it, but it is the Japanese manga series Dungeon Meshi. This is number 7, which I just got recently, and I'm trying to make my way through in Japanese for the first time. I read 1 through 6 in English, and I'm not picking a single one because it's all like one story. If I were to pick a single one, it would be number 5, because from 1 to 5 they just keep getting better and better. So 5 is like kind of the high point. This is a high fantasy cooking manga where a group of adventurers travels through a dungeon, going ever and ever deeper into this enchanted dungeon to try and find a dragon which has eaten one of their companions, and to defeat the dragon and rescue the companion. And along the way they have to eat a lot of monsters. So it's kind of like a monster of the week kind of deal. Like, what are they going to encounter, how are they going to eat it, is one of the main things driving you through the beginning of the manga. But also through the cooking they usually solve some intergroup tension between personalities, or something which has been frustrating for one of the characters. There's always a psychological element which creates characterization through these little events as it goes forward. Maybe it being here at the top of the list reflects some of the things that I've been valuing lately in life. I don't know. It's quite strange to actually say it right after Truckers, because both Truckers and Dungeon Meshi are like fantasies which are light-hearted and simple and fun and easy to consume, while also touching on some very serious themes. But they also both focus on the group more than the individual. Dungeon Meshi is more character focused than Truckers, but there's a strong focus on like groups of adventurers who go into the dungeon, and how the individuals in each group affect the group as a whole, and how being in that group forces people to kind of change their behaviors and adapt and cooperate and compromise all the time. And I guess just exploring that, like how we can coexist and cooperate and make little tribes in order to get by in the world, is something which is very interesting to me. And reading Dungeon Meshi, you feel a part of the tribe of the main characters. You really feel like you're in there, you know who they are, you know how they act. And when you get introduced to other tribes, as in other kind of groups, they're not actually tribes, I'm just using the word tribes, but like other groups of adventurers throughout the series, you start to realize how difficult it is for people to, I don't know, to coexist and to work together and to just treat each other nicely when everyone, even if you're all meaning well, comes from such different places. I might be giving the wrong impression here because it's a fun, really, really silly, like basically stupid manga about just like eating goblins. No, goblins, they don't eat humanoids, that's a rule. But you know, like eating magical creatures and surviving and cooking them into lovely Japanese themed food all the way through. But yeah, I've already talked about this series a lot, and I'm going to keep talking about it a lot because I'm only on 7 and there's lots more to go, and it's going to take me a long time to read it if I keep on with the Japanese. I will say that one of the delights of being in Japan now has been finding Dungeon Meshi merchandise because it's not very popular here. It's not a huge manga or anime or anything like that, but it's Japan, so you will find merchandise for basically any manga fandom that exists, and Dungeon Meshi is no exception. In fact, there is a museum exhibit which is about, limited time only, about to close, and which happens to be here in Fukuoka Prefecture. So I have to take a train for about 2 hours, but maybe this week, maybe next week, I'm gonna go see the museum exhibit of Dungeon Meshi and, I don't know, buy some stickers or something like that and see the original artwork for how she was crafting the manga. I should have said it's by Ryoko Kui, who's a genius at writing and drawing and everything. But yeah, I'm going to go to that museum and it's going to be the best time ever. And maybe I'll upload some footage or something. But anyway, cozy fantasy frameworks for dealing with the big themes in life. That's where I was in 2024, and that's where I am going into 2025. Do let me know what you've been reading, if you had a best book of 2024, or if anything on this list intrigued you. Please, let's chat about it down in the comments. Otherwise, I will catch you in my next video. See you later.